The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Iran Conflict, Fallout and Future. The US-Israel war with Iran has wrought profound regional and global consequences. Beyond the toll of casualties and political upheaval, it has triggered heightened security concerns and widespread economic chaos, while a humanitarian crisis looms as countless civilians throughout the Middle East face displacement. Today, the conflict's trajectory remains unpredictable. Might the international community facilitate lasting peace, with dialogue paving the way for de-escalation, despite competing agendas? Or will continued hostilities drive further instability and economic hardship? To learn more, tune into our live debate, sharing your questions and comments with our expert panel.
Hello and welcome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and this is the Democracy Forum debate, where we examine global challenges of the day that are often impacting all our lives. The Iran conflict, fallout, and future. Not only is this a long-running, unresolved issue, it's also a perpetually breaking story such that our discussion could be diverted from events at any times. But the past few weeks, why has it happened? How will events unfold? And why is the nations of this region unable to live in peace with each other? Yeah, we think we know, but perhaps we don't. And to debate these points, we have an excellent panel of experts: Sina, Toossi, Maryam, Alemzadeh, Maral, Karimi, and Thomas Juneau. The Democracy Forum Chair, Barry Gardner, will be with us throughout, and he will sum up at the end. And as always, I have the privilege of asking the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar, which we've called in response to the far-reaching economic and political consequences of the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East. I'd like to thank the team at TDF for arranging this event and for inviting our panelists to participate. We are very grateful that they've been able to find the time to join us today and to share their insights and their perspectives with us. And as always, we are indebted to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. Launching Operation Epic Fury, a precision bombing campaign against Iran and its proxies in Lebanon on the 28th of February, the United States and Israel have attempted to decapitate the regime and neutralize its ability to retaliate. Viewed strictly in military terms, the assault has achieved tactical success by hitting 13,000 targets in 40 days. But it has not eliminated Iran's capacity to defend itself and to launch counterattacks. And it has been overshadowed by the lack of operational legitimacy and by the absence of any coherent strategic planning, thereby resulting in regional escalation, drawing all 6 Gulf cooperation countries into the fray, blocking the Strait of Hormuz, destabilizing world energy markets by increasing the price of crude oil by 40%, and pushing the global economy towards inevitable recession. Writing in the Financial Times last month, Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, describes the current conflict as the greatest global energy security threat in history. Although the peace talks brokered by Pakistan at the weekend ended in failure, they were the most prominent to be held between the United States and Iran since 1979. But neither side appeared willing to step back from their entrenched positions and to find a way to end the conflict. Of course, there was always a risk that the two adversaries would misread one another, writes The Economist. But it turns out that the auspices for holding the talks were flawed. Acting as mediator, Pakistan misinterpreted its remit by letting the Iranians believe that Israel's war in Lebanon was included in the ceasefire and that the United States had agreed to unfreeze $6 billion of Iranian oil funds in return for opening the Strait of Hormuz. We await with interest the news announced this morning that talks may resume later this week. But as The Economist observes, I quote, the outcome in Islamabad underscores how hard it is to end a war that both sides believe themselves to be winning. And having repeatedly justified military action to force Iran to surrender its stockpile of enriched uranium to prevent it from developing a weapon of mass destruction, it may be argued that the United States has now armed Iran far more lethally with a weapon of mass disruption, the Hormuz chokehold. President Trump yesterday responded to the failure of the talks in Islamabad by threatening to enforce a blockade of Iranian ports in order to maximize pressure on the regime by preventing it from exporting oil, thereby significantly reducing its foreign earnings. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has responded by describing a United States naval blockade as piracy and threatens retaliation. Writing in the Financial Times yesterday, Gideon Rachman reinforces the view that Trump's latest tactical ploy may backfire, primarily because, I quote, the Iranians believe that time is on their side in this confrontation, and they are probably right. And interviewed by the Washington Post yesterday, a former lead negotiator for the United States team which concluded the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, said, I quote, we had diplomacy, we had maximum pressure sanctions, and we had the military. Of the three, I think it's hard to dispute that the first was the most successful. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or points you want to raise, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Bruce, very much for that. Weapons of mass disruption, and the Iranians believe that time is on their side. Our first contributor is Sina Toossi, a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., whose research focuses on US-Iran relations, the Middle East, and nuclear issues. He's a familiar voice and pen and face throughout global media. Recent pieces have highlighted the Iranian voices America isn't hearing and Washington's Iran groupthink. So, Sina Toossi, the Iraq conflict, fallout and future, give us your analysis.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. I think, when we look at the drivers of this conflict, how we got into this war, we see, as was pointed out in the introductory remarks, that in the past, there's been different models for approaching Iran. Me sitting here in Washington, I've seen up front and been part of these debates where you have a camp of analysts and officials and former administrations that had pursued a diplomatic approach towards Iran, or diplomacy first. And you had, as testament to their efforts, you had the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, negotiated by the Obama administration. And underpinning that was certain logic and argumentation about the efficacy of diplomacy, the costs of war. But under the Trump administration, they abandoned that working diplomatic model and they pursued escalation with Iran. In 2018, Trump left the nuclear deal. He pursued maximum pressure marked by very severe economic sanctions against Iran and maximalist demands. The demands really since 2018, when Pompeo laid out 10 demands of Iran, and even throughout Trump's second term in these negotiations that we've seen, the demands have been that Iran has to give up its entire nuclear program, end enrichment, give up its regional alliance network, its missile program. These demands that Iran viewed as untenable and challenging its core means of deterrence and core security interests. But we've seen in the Trump era, the camp that has come to the fore that I argued in my piece that you just mentioned led us into this war. The more hawkish camp, the camp that believed in maximum pressure, that believed in an escalatory approach could result in positive political change in Iran, regime change in Iran, or get the Iranians to capitulate. And this really rested on groupthink and confirmation bias. A lot of the classic textbook psychological characteristics that hamper proper decision-making. And we saw that leading into this war, the dominant paradigm that really became entrenched amongst proponents of this policy and the Trump administration by extension was that the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, was a paper tiger that had been greatly weakened over the past several years, especially in the post-October 7th world. And that with one more push, a military escalation, a military conflict, that it would collapse or capitulate. And Trump, his rhetoric betrayed this, both leading up to the war and in the early days of the war. And if you track his rhetoric throughout the war, initially when he launched the war that Saturday morning with the assassination of Khamenei on February 28th, he called on the Iranian people to rise up. Netanyahu made similar statements. But then Trump himself has admitted he did not think that Iran would hit back in the region. It seems like they greatly miscalculated, Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz and hit back in the region. And these are all things that, people who've been in the Iran policy debate in Washington, the proponents of diplomacy in the past and broader Iran, the experts of Iran in Washington have long argued that this was Iran's military doctrine. This was in all of Iranian military and planning for the past several decades. A conflict with the U.S. always centered in their planning on disrupting the Persian Gulf, disrupting the Strait of Hormuz, and U.S. power projection capabilities, in Iran's immediate neighborhood in the Persian Gulf. So this wasn't a surprise. This should have been expected. But nevertheless, Trump and them and Netanyahu, he bought into this narrative that the regime was very fragile. It would collapse with one more push. And we've seen that as a result, the regime has proved much more resilient than many people expected. Certainly the Trump administration, it fought, for these past 40 days. As was mentioned, it kept up its ballistic missile and cruise missile and drone attacks throughout the region. It hit many critical targets and sensitive military and economic infrastructure in the region. And foremost in terms of Iranian leverage coming out of this war is the successful closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which was accomplished not through, attacking every tanker, laying mines all over the Strait and the Persian Gulf, but really through the threat of attack and the risk aversion of tanker companies and these local economies there that prevented that these tankers did not transit the Straits. And now we're in a situation where the Iranians believe they are emerging from this war with greater leverage, a stronger hand, not just their enriched uranium stockpile, not just the fact that they are left standing, but also that they have this card of the Strait of Hormuz closure that is creating knock-on effects and mounting economic effects in the global economy. And so that is why, that is what these negotiations in Pakistan have been about. And we'll see if they reach a result. But at the moment, both sides still seem pretty far apart in their demands.
Thank you very much for that. Since you're in Washington, the fallout and future we're talking about, firstly, the fallout in Washington on the intelligence analysis not being taken note of, and of the whole of the administration at the moment, the fallout with NATO, all of that. Is this permanent or is it just this administration?
Well, Donald Trump is someone who famously does not take his military and intelligence briefings seriously. This is
nor did George W. I mean, the Iraq War, you had a similar issue, didn't you? So we've now had two major wars that have been happening on false intelligence, probably more.
Yeah, so this is a common thread that, this distrust of certain, American military and intelligence apparatus, or at least their briefings, taking second tier to the political aspirations of this person who holds the office, in this case, Donald Trump, who I think coming into this war, he was kind of riding high on his perceived political victories over the Venezuela situation, kidnapping Maduro, over the 12-day war against Iran last summer, where Trump, came in for one and done kind of strikes against the nuclear facilities. And he managed to portray both of these events as great military accomplishments, even though they're very questionable.
Does it go further than just this one presidency? How permanent is the fallout?
That is hard to say, because I think Trump is somewhat of an anomaly, even in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. the main contenders, I think, for 2028, I don't think would necessarily have this approach, but it does play into the decreasing legitimacy of kind of establishment politics, media, and by extension, the kind of intelligence and security institutions in America as well.
And can I just put one question that's coming from the audience from Prashant Kumar? If the US does not address its own failings in letting this unnecessary war happen, is it setting out the groundwork for future conflicts?
Yes, I think that is a very realistic concern. That if we look at the factors that led into this war, again, I highlighted these problems within the foreign policy establishment in the US, confirmation bias, groupthink, people getting comfortable in flawed assumptions, that these are recipe for more foreign entanglements. I mean, arguably, this is what led to the Iraq war. This is what led to past military quagmire. So I think when it comes to foreign policy decision-making in the US, that it needs reform, and that to get out of these, the risk of these conflicts, the risk of these entanglements, it does require reform and novel thinking and more kind of open debate, really.
Right. Thank you very much. Stay with us because we will be coming back to you. Really appreciate that for opening our debate. Next, we have Dr. Maryam Alemzadeh, Associate Professor of History and Politics of Iran at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. Her current research covers revolutions, state building, militias and militaries, and modern Iran. And her upcoming book is entitled Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards, A History. Tell us about that, Maryam Alemzadeh. Tell us everything you know.
Thank you so much for having me. I would need a bit more than 5 minutes for that, but I'll try to squeeze as much as possible in. I'd like to bring up a few points about the IRGC based on my research, which is on the history of their formation, their kind of first decade of their existence, but can have serious implications on how we understand them today. So if we look a bit closely, we might realize that both the Revolutionary Guards and the Iranian political leadership at large have always cast this ambiguous and contradictory public image of themselves, and done that very frequently. On the one hand, they project this image of a ruthless, highly bureaucratized, totalitarian entity, and on the other hand, they appear more than occasionally to be sloppy, amateur, opportunist power grabbers, and so on. So Revolutionary Guards and the Iranian elite at large cast a self-image of power and prowess on the one hand, which is the image, by the way, that most influential international actors, including Israel and the United States, reinforce in their discourse and behavior, like presenting Iran as the existential threat, the head of the octopus and whatnot. But on the other, the guards and the politicians at the top of the echelon in Iran have revealed moments, incidents, and even sustained stretches of chaos and incapacity. Their vulnerability to the assassinations, the attacks, both in the 12-day June war and in the current conflict, is a good example of that. Has shocked many people how penetrable they have been. So in my research about the IRGC's history, I have found that informality and flexibility is built into the IRGC as their MO, as their winning card. So there is no Leviathan, so to speak. The weaknesses and the strengths are both like sides of the same coin. I have looked at a lot of material like interviews and meeting minutes and archival materials, memoirs, published documents as well. And to come to the conclusion that informality and spontaneity and the resulting inefficiencies were actually an essential element in the Guards' toolkit as they rose to power. I'm happy to talk about the past more, but let me get to the present and what it means for our understanding today. Let me first propose this, that with the current war, something seems to have changed. We're seeing a different image of the Guards. They are presenting a more united front, it seems. They seem to have acted in a very calculated manner, planning their drone and missile attacks patiently and strategically, which is not something they're known for if you know a little bit about the history of the Iran-Iraq war and their like many blunders after that. They have made excellent use of their strategic grip on the Strait of Hormuz. As we all know, they have broken the internet with their AI-generated propaganda memes successfully. And I think this is like less talked about, but they have toned down the axis of resistance discourse, and as well as the Islamic identity part of the propaganda to a large extent. What has changed, in my assessment, is not the methods and capabilities of the IRGC. They're not all of a sudden overnight a super organized conventional military now. In fact, actually, the decentralized ad hoc informal order has helped them not rely on top level of leadership and sustain themselves despite the massive hits. In fact, I think what is known today as the Mosaic Doctrine, they 13 decentralized centers of command, I don't think it's a new thing. People say it was introduced by Khamenei, senior Khamenei, intentionally in sort of anticipation of such a war. But it was at most a formalization of what already existed in the IRGC. IRGC has always operated in a decentral way, in an ad hoc manner, sort of supporting and instigating institutionalizing a culture of firing at will and direct action. So that's not something new. That hasn't changed, and that has, in fact, like always, been proved to be a source of power. I have two hypotheses about what has changed that we see a somewhat different image in this war. One is the war condition itself, which pushes all actors to, well, not all, we could maybe exceptionalize Donald Trump, but usually it pushes you to the sort of uppermost limits of your rationality in order to be able to survive the crisis. But more importantly, and this might be a little bit controversial and hard to substantiate, but I think the removal, the elimination of Ayatollah Khamenei himself plays into this changing image. The matter of fact is, and analysts have pointed this out occasionally, that Khamenei had this ambiguous policy of neither here nor there, and like he famously said, we're not going to negotiate and there won't be a war either. It was always just keeping everything on the brink, not being clear what Iran wants, what the red lines are, sending people to negotiate, but addressing the domestic crowd by saying, no, we will never negotiate with the United States, and so on and so forth. I think the removal of Khamenei has actually brought strategic clarity for Iran. It does not mean that the IRGC and the current political elite, the surviving political elite, are unanimous on everything. No, there are still moderates, hardliners, etc. But I think they agree on what's best during the war conditions, which is pushing the United States and Israel as far as possible to get as many concessions as possible. But it also means, and I have written about this in a recent piece for Engelsberg Ideas, it also means that possibly in the post-war situation, whenever that materializes, we will have a moderate government at work, because they will need to be rational, work to mend the collapsing economy, keep the domestic population a little bit happier. I mean, they're not gonna gain back popular legitimacy at all, but at least put the risk of a nationwide protests, postpone it for a little bit. So, and I think the Ayatollah Khamenei not being there actually will leave the IRGC's hands open to take that route.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Can I just the IRGC within the envelope of the whole Iranian state, from the way you said the planning of the Hormuz, the missile strikes and all the rest of it, they're running this war, are they?
That's my understanding. It's very hard to get data on it.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Your understanding surrounding the war. So Iran also has an army, it has an intelligence service, all that, but the IRGC sits on top of all that. But also, just for audiences outside, this is still a state operation, isn't it? So, when the Western politicians talk about the IRGC, often it's as if they're talking about Al Qaeda or something, but it is a state operation that is responsible within the government.
That's a very good point. Yes, it is very much a state operation. The IRGC has long been known as the shadow state in Iran.
It's not a shadow state like Hezbollah is in Lebanon.
Sorry, say that again.
It's not a shadow state like Hezbollah is in Lebanon.
No, it's a little bit different because Hezbollah is like one sort of party among many that have a status within the power sharing arrangement in Lebanon, whereas the IRGC has kind of the supreme position. It has no rivals. It is not a secondary sort of like a sectarian army. It is the Iranian army, even though there is a regular army parallel to it, but it doesn't have much political clout.
And did the IRGC run the recent repression of the protests in Iran, or was that another organization?
They were definitely involved, but over the years, after the end of the Iran-Iraq War in the late 80s, Iran has, like the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic has developed multiple repressive apparatuses that are like separate from the IRGC. But whenever the protests are too large to be contained by the police and the special forces and the law enforcement, the IRGC and the Basij, which is like technically one of their branches, step in.
And I want to loop in a question from the Ritesh Nigam. You have answered it, but we can. How does the future of the IRGC now look? And then you went on to reference that quite likely you could get a moderate government here who's giving the people more. Can you just sum that up?
Yes, for sure. I think with Khamenei removed, the IRGC's more moderate, more business-minded factions. By moderate, I don't necessarily mean ideologically moderate. I mean that they know that a cooling down of the international, like basically hostilities, is necessary for running business better. They will have a chance to have a stronger voice. And additionally, in the post-war situation itself kind of like has the effect of toning down the ideological like sharpness of the like loyal hardliners. That's exactly what happened after the Iran-Iraq War. And it has been like documented and researched that the generation that went through the war were much more milder in attitude and in ideology than their children, the new generation that had not gone through the war. Now that generation has gone through a war of its own. And it could have the similar effect.
That's a very interesting point. We will move on from where you've taken us there. Thank you very much for that. And in a couple of minutes, we're going to come back. But firstly, we're just going to go to a very short break. Welcome back. And our third contributor to this debate is Dr. Maral Karimi. from Toronto Metropolitan University, and the author of the Iranian Green Movement of 2009, Reverberating Echoes of Resistance. As a child, she lived witnessing the violence and volatility and the vengeance in Iran that made her acutely aware of the challenges in that country. She specializes in media and communications, specifically in the role of media in social movements. So what will be the fallout and future of today's conflict? Maral, Karimi, share with us what you know.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for having me, and I would like to speak to certain nuances that often get lost when studying Iran. For example, much of the current discussion around Iran is organized around the idea of a rupture, war, leadership change. We often hear the name Iran when there is a conflict or the possibility of the collapse of the Iranian regime. So I want to begin by cautioning against that assumption. It was and that this war is going to lead to the collapse of the regime. It was always analytically weak, in my opinion, to assume that the removal of a single figure, i.e., Ayatollah Khamenei, would or even some of the central figures of the IRI would produce systemic collapse. And so that's what I want to begin with. But the Islamic Republic is not reducible to an individual. And I think Sina was talking about it earlier. I think that's a colossal mistake that the Trump administration and many Iranian diaspora groups and some other Israelis and others have made. The Iranian state is a layered political system distributed across institutions such as the IRGC, clerical networks, bureaucratic state, and numerous other hegemonic and coercive apparatus, including security and intelligence institutions over time, and particularly under conditions of crises, especially after the 2009 Green Movement, the system has developed mechanisms of redundancy and continuity. So the IRGC quickly realized the extent and the impact of the Green Movement in 2009, and what could a similar movement of similar scale would mean for the state. So, in my opinion, they're not just the post 2009. They're not just an ideological and military apparatus. They also embedded themselves largely and diligently in the Iranian economy, as well as developing a new post-national, post-Islamist ideology, like a nationalist ideology that helped them to some extent justify going into Syria and developing their proxies, etc. And it's a strategy that might not have worked for the resistance movements within Iran, but it has worked perfectly for the IRGC and for the current conflict. It has had positive responses for Iran's defense in certain areas. So what I'm trying to say is the system is designed to survive shock. And this has intensified particularly after the Green Movement. And so the IRI's, Islamic Republic of Iran's analytical resilience, however, should not be mistaken for political legitimacy or long-term longevity. I am not pointing to the fact that, I'm not making a claim that this regime is a stable one. It is far from stable. And since its inception, the regime in Tehran, the Islamic Republic, was built on consolidation of power through elimination, both physical purges and ideological repression of competing revolutionary forces. And it suffers from internal divisions and elite tensions, which some of which was talked about just now. And there are obviously many resistance movements and tensions within the population as well. Additionally, this is a system by design that is increasingly neither willing nor economically, socially, and politically capable of meeting the basic needs of its citizens. Mind you, this to some extent might change depending on the what comes of the negotiations and where Iran might end on what Iran's place on the spectrum would be after these negotiations and what the results are going to be. So at this moment in history, this is my analysis. So, however, in response to that inability and unwillingness to meet the citizens' needs, um, social movements in Iran has significantly intensified, and also and simultaneously they're chipping away at the regime's ever shrinking base. Into the social movements that we saw in 2017, 2018, 2019 were largely bread riots. These are the classes and the strata of the society that were largely supportive of the regime. They were the ideological base of the Islamic Republic. And to see that slowly shrinking, that kind of rang the warning bells for the Islamic Republic. And obviously there are other movements prior and after that that were different in their nature in terms of their class positioning and their political and social grievances. But the base of the Islamic Republic, if you remember Khomeini, and to some degree, and years later, Khamenei always talked about Dawlat Mustazafan, or the government of the poor and the downtrodden, and that was those were the strata of the society, the working class, the unemployed workers, and the poor working class who were on the streets between 2017 and 2019 largely. And so the base is increasingly shrinking, and for an ideological state, that is very important and very threatening. What we're currently witnessing, though, is not cohesion within the system, as some analysts might want to project, or as I'm sure the Islamic Republic wants to project. It's a fragmentation along class, geography, ethnicity, and gender, just to name a few of these fragmentation. In my research, I specifically look at class, gender, and ethnicity, and I consider them the three largest um, um, gaps and rifts within the society. Um, and the management of these rifts has becoming increasingly difficult and impossible for the region, for the state. Um, On another note, the scale of repression and its normalization, whether it's violent repression, the physical purges, internet blockouts, um, uh, and other means, they're not indicators of a stable and um, um, in charge um, government. They're actually indicative of a system that is increasingly can only resort to repression to maintain control. The regime is not collapsing by any means, not at this moment, for a variety of reasons, but as its coffers are shrinking and its capacity for economic co-optation diminishes, the IRI relies far more heavily, in my opinion, on repression than before. The various form of violence, as I mentioned. So this brings me to a second issue: how we talk about Iranian society. which goes into that notion of, is the system collapsing, or what do Iranians want? Much of the discussion assumes that the Iranian people form a monolithic political unit, that Iranians are a singular voice, that there's very little diversity, or that they can be represented by a single demand or a single voice. And that assumption does not hold. We've seen over and over again that assumption does not hold. However, that is increasingly what world leaders, foreign world leaders, rely on. The Iranian society is deeply diverse, as I mentioned, and segmented along ethnic, class, gender, geography, culture, language lines. And these different groups have different relationships to the state. They have different political languages, they have different demands, and they have different forms of articulation of their political demands. Within that complexity, however, there are some actors and there are some movements that carry more emancipatory potential, in my opinion. Women groups, labor organizations, some of the ethnic, minoritized ethnic groups that are looking for more decentralized form of government, more equity, and they're challenging the notions of Persian-centric government that subordinates all the other ethnicities one way or another. And so these are they're far from marginal actors, and they're some of the most important sites of political resistance.
Okay.
But they're
Hello?
yes.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, we're out of time, and also you've been your screen has been frozen, so I've had to be on screen as well. I don't know, but no, that was great. I just wanted to. I didn't want to go completely out of time, but a couple of points. Because Peter Cornish has come in from the audience. Given the very diverse nature of Iranian society, will it ever be possible to give society a regime that can be truly representative of the people?
I mean, I live in Canada. Canada is quite diverse. I'm sure England is not a unitary state.
Yeah.
The United States has over 300 million people, multiple ethnicities, races.
Yeah, sure. So the answer is yes. And can I just ask you whether you agree then with the previous panelist Maryam Alemzadeh that a new government that comes post-war could be more moderate, could be giving people what they want? Because you talked about the tool of repression. Is there a tool of moderation as well?
I think there is a potential for that, like I mentioned, depending on whether the outcome of negotiations. We have to first look into why a regime resorts to violence in the first place. If the regime cannot represent its majority of its constituents, or it's not willing to represent them, then it has to increasingly resort to violence. Now, there are times that they can, co-opt certain parts of the population through economics, through economic co-optation, through ideology, subordinating one group to another. But in the long run, if we're going to have an Iranian state, multiple groups that are currently being silenced, that have historically over the past 100 years throughout this regime and the previous regime have been silenced, need to be able to give a voice, both in how the society is run and how this structures, if there's going to be changes or a new regime, the structures of the government, of the politics are going to.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Stay with us. And now we're going to go to our final contributor, Professor Thomas Juneau, the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. He's also with Chatham House in London, with a research focus on the Middle East, Iran, Yemen in particular, and the role of intelligence in national security and foreign policy making. So where does Canada particularly, and where do Middle East powers sit in Iran's future? And what could be the fallout? Thomas Juneau, give us your arguments.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to the other three speakers. These were great presentations. So my focus typically is on Iranian foreign policy, regional security, but when I saw the theme of the session today, I chose to focus on the aspect of fallout and future of where things could be going in the future, but trying to ground these predictions in the past, and especially in past patterns, not just plucking predictions out of thin air. One way to my starting point for this analysis will be that by some indicators, the Islamic Republic will be weakened after this war. Yes, there's the major dimension of the precedent of having taken control of the Strait of Hormuz, having blocked it. That does provide tremendous leverage to Iran. I think Sina made the very good point that everybody with half a brain knew that this was a tool that Iran would use when war would become a war of survival, as it has been the case here. This has been war gamed to death over the years. But putting aside that very important dimension, the Islamic Republic will be weakened on many other aspects because of the strikes, the military infrastructure, the economic infrastructure that has been damaged, and so on. But at the same time, given the dynamics of the war, as was discussed before, given everything that has been going on, at the same time, the Islamic Republic will be vengeful. It will be more aggressive on some indicators. That will be the case domestically, as was mentioned. I think repression will be brutal when, not if, but when protesters start coming back to the streets. But the one aspect that I want to focus on for the few brief minutes that I have is repression, but beyond Iran's borders, what we now call transnational repression, which is when a state represses individuals, not only with ties to the motherland, so Iranian Canadians, Iranian Americans, Iranian British, Chinese Canadians, Chinese Americans, or in some cases, people who don't have that ethnic tie to the country of origin, because they militate for democracy, for human rights in the country of origin. So right now, with a colleague here in Canada, I'm writing a book on transnational repression, focused on how the big three, in our country at least, China, India, and Iran. Russia is less of a focus for us, as it is for some other countries, notably Great Britain. In the context of that research, we've done about 100 interviews with victims of transnational repression, as well as government officials who are working on the response. So I just want to say a couple things about the book, and then I'll say one important point about where this might be going in the future. We've separated the research in 4 buckets. First of all, the tools of transnational repression. They are well known on some fronts, but we are really mapping out the conditions under which these 3 countries are using a range of tools, physical tools, so physical intimidation, monitoring, surveillance in the target country. Online transnational repression, which has really exploded in recent years, where a wide range of tools here can be used: intimidation, threats, defamation, disinformation in many cases. And what we're finding here in particular is how there is an especially violent gender dimension to these various tools of online transnational repression, where in many cases women activists will be victims of especially brutal defamation, disinformation, threats, abuse, and so on. The third category of tool is targeting the families back in China or back in Iran, back in India in particular. And this, as I'll mention in my next point, is particularly effective. The second bucket of research that we've done is the impact. So here we've asked Iranian Canadians and others, what has been the impact? Has it affected your work? A wide range of responses here. from no, it has not impacted my work, even if it has been difficult, all the way to I have had to stop my activism in favor of human rights or democracy because of the pressure, and everything in between. There is no universal rule, but by far the most important variable in shaping where individuals found themselves on this spectrum is whether they have family back in Iran. It is not the only variable that matters, but it has really been by far the most important one. So where for individuals who have close family as opposed to more distant family in Iran, pressure was far more likely to push them to stop or at least slow down their activism. We've also focused a lot of our research on the personal impact of transnational repression, the toll that it takes on your well-being, on your emotional well-being, which for a lot of individuals was absolutely huge. And that is an aspect of transnational repression that remains very poorly understood. And I think that the data that we're starting to gather here can be useful to trigger a bit more of a discussion on not only the professional impact, but also the personal one. We also asked our interviewees about their perception of government responses. And here the answers have been quite interesting. And I'll focus on the Iranian case. There was an expectation by many people that there would be serious mistrust of government, which you do see in a number of diaspora communities. But to my surprise, and to a lot of people's surprise, we didn't really see that, certainly not among Iranian Canadians, where there was not a perception that Canadian security and law enforcement agencies should be mistrusted. The criticism was more in terms of neglect. We trust them, we just don't feel that they care very much about the threats that we face. The fourth bucket of research, and I'm going obviously over all of this quite superficially, was the importance of diaspora politics. And this has been extremely interesting to try to better understand. But if I simplify what is obviously a much more complicated picture, the extent of fragmentation in a diaspora community will have a strong correlation with the ease of penetration by the perpetrator of transnational repression. Basically, what that means in plainer language is that if the community, the diaspora community, Iranian Canadians, is heavily fragmented, which it is, polarized, heavily fragmented, then that makes the job of the Islamic Republic easier to target individuals, and in direct parallel, it makes the job of Canadian authorities much more difficult to protect these populations and to counter that transnational repression. That is true in the Canadian case, but it can absolutely be generalized beyond my country into the US and European countries as well. The one point that I want to make before I stop to try to keep this short is one of the questions that we asked people we interviewed was, what triggers spikes in transnational repression? There is a constant baseline that is fairly high, certainly among Iranian Canadians, but you can say that about Iranian Americans, Iranian British, Iranian Swedes, notably, as well as a range of others. And here, what we found intuitively makes absolute sense. So no one would be surprised by the conclusion, but we really were able to find the data that backs up that plausible hypothesis, which is when two variables are present, you see a spike in transnational repression by the Islamic Republic of Iran. One is a sense of growing or increased regime vulnerability. If the regime feels more under pressure, both domestically and geopolitically, it will be likely to engage in more transnational repression. And two is enhanced diaspora mobilization. And this is also something in informal conversations that I saw in other countries, notably in Europe and the United States. So when you have a combination of two variables, the regime feels more vulnerable geopolitically and domestically, and diasporas abroad are mobilizing more than they usually do, then when these two combine, you have a spike in transnational repression activity by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we clearly saw that in Canada in two instances. One was after PS 752 in 2020. If you remember, that is the flight from Tehran to Ukraine that was shot down by IRGC air defenses in early January 2020. Of the 176 people who died on board, 55 were Canadian citizens and 30 were Canadian permanent residents. So there was a strong connection to my country as a result of that tragedy. And the second instance was obviously Women, Life, Freedom in the fall of 2022, and that carried over in 2023, when in both cases, 2020, 2022, and 3, you saw the regime under pressure and enhanced mobilization abroad. In the case of PS 752, the Association of Families of Victims in particular, and you saw a clear spike in the months that followed of transnational repression by Iran in Canada. as well as in other countries, notably in Britain in the case of PS 752, and multiple countries in the case of women, life, freedom. So, and I'll finish on this point. My assessment, based on precedent and based on past patterns, is that 2026, with the regime, as was said by my colleagues, surviving in all likelihood, but under pressure and expecting enhanced diaspora mobilization abroad, to see far more transnational repression than we usually see, not only in my country, but in most other countries where there are Iranian diaspora communities as well. And on that, thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I just want to come back to this thought about the moderation, or what they're going to give to the population. So you've got the repression on the one hand, but are they going to give anything? Are they going to loosen anything up in order to get a more compliant population?
Very hard to say, given that we still don't know yet where the pieces are falling after the war. I mean, we're not after the war yet. I think there is a clear scenario where the regime is on many indicators harsher in terms of its repression, will tolerate no dissent. What we saw in January in terms of the massive crackdown will only be a sign of what would come next. But at the same time, a certain relaxation, notably on some social restrictions, possibly to try to ease some of that pressure, that is conceivable, but not as a sign of an overall opening up, just as a sign of a small pressure valve.
Can I open up? I want to ask you this, Thomas, but also open up this general thought to the panel as a whole. If we go into a wider context, when China became the world's pariah in 1989, it went in for repression, but it also delivered to the people, such that they all became very wealthy, and the rest of it. And just recently, we've had Viktor Orban's defeat in Hungary, but Peter Magyar and the commentators of this are saying it's all very well winning the election, but you have to also work with the previous leaders' institutions. So on that reflect, what is Iran thinking, as far as you know, about its long-term future, how it handles it, and what is the US really thinking about when it talks about regime change?
Again, very difficult to answer that question, given that the dust has not settled yet, and it will be a
while. Let's assume the dust has settled somewhere, because it will settle.
The China model has been mentioned for decades, as long as I can remember, and I've been working on Iran for 20 years now, of a opening on the economic front and not on the political front. So economic but not political liberalization. Now, what is a bit in vogue is to use the MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman parallel from Saudi Arabia, where there is no political, obviously, liberalization, but a degree of economic reform, even if the context is not the same as China. Is either of those, or some version, a possibility in Iran in the mid to longer term? For now, I'm skeptical, given the reorganization of the regime as the dust settles after the war. I'm skeptical that the incentives are there, and that the will is there to get into that direction. I could easily be proven wrong.
Can I bring Sina Toossi back in now on this point of, once the dust is settled, where do you think Iran is going to be heading? Where is that mindset going to be?
Yes, so I had heard from sources in Iran after the January crackdown and massacres that Ali Larijani had in mind this kind of scenario, that he greenlighted that brutal crackdown of protesters with an eye to pursuing kind of Deng Xiaoping-like reforms, something like a Tiananmen Square massacre followed by reforms and, delivering more economically. But I think, the crux of the issue is the US-Iran relationship, that Iran, for as long as it's been under, U.S. sanctions, it's been on the outs and in the penalty box from the U.S.-led global order, that it cannot develop economically to really meet the needs of its people. And so that is a critical outcome of this war that could decide the future trajectory of.
And just since you're in Washington, the commentary that's coming out about Viktor Orban's defeat and Peter Magyar's victory, but he's inheriting Viktor Orban's institutions. Any regime change, and we've just heard how diverse this country is, there cannot be regime change, can there? Because those institutions are going to remain in place.
No, that's a very important point, and I think that's one thing that Trump has been very comfortable with. We saw it with Venezuela. He didn't want any kind of, what happened in Iraq and de-Baathification and destroying the Iraqi state and building it from scratch. That he was okay with a regime change being like the head is gone. And to your point, in Iran, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where like there's bottom up, regime change that totally gets rid of the Islamic Republic and all of its institutions, but that gradual change of someone like Ghalibaf, if they manage to make a deal with the U.S. that gets them out of this kind of economic stranglehold and they can change things politically, it'll still be that same, institutions and structure by and large.
Yeah. And then, can I bring back Maryam Alemzadeh that you brought in thank you. On this idea of, let's say the dust settles somewhere, where does Iran, what is the mindset of Iran as far as moving forward? Repression, moderation, wealth creation?
I think there is definitely incentive for wealth creation. Whether or not it can achieve an MBS Saudi level or a post-Tiananmen China level is another issue. The informality and the sort of ambiguity that has been institutionalized in the system means that it's not very proficient, even if it sets its mind, if there is a unified mind to achieve this. In terms of repression, I agree that if there is any liberalization, it will be mostly in economy and less on the side of politics. The difference between Iran and sort of like Gulf countries' authoritarianism, or the China model is this. Compared to the Gulf countries, Iran has a much older and much stronger civil society. So that kind of repression, even let me put it this way, even if the economic relief happens and there's like some wealth is injected into the society, the Iranian civil society will not sit back and watch things go by that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Maral, Karimi, could you address this one? I want to get this balance between repression and moderation.
I think once the dust settles, depending on where it settles, a few things will happen. One thing that will happen, in my opinion, there's a great likelihood of it happening, is there's going to be a large purge once the negotiations are over, both physically of dissidents, of people who participated in any kind of dissentive action, and also in terms of appropriating land and real estate in their possessions. Very similar to what happened at the beginning of the revolution. I think if there are going to be any social change, socio-political changes, they're largely going to be informal. For example, in the format of looking the other way. For example, the laws of family court laws and marriage and divorce that are largely undermine women's rights are not going to be changed. I don't see them being changed willingly even in the next 10 years. This is not just a structural issue within the Islamic Republic, which it is also the matter of the Iranian people and the education that has not been instilled in these matters over the past few decades, not just under the Islamic Republic. But you have to understand, when we're talking about structures, the Islamic Republic is a continuation of the Pahlavi state, simply because majority of the structures of those institutions didn't necessarily change once Khomeini took over.
I have to stop, but that's a really good point. So it's a continuation of the state that was before that. We are now going to go to the Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardner, after which I want to come back to each of you just to give us a top line, a couple of words on the fallout and the future. And to mention that Barry Gardiner is a senior member of Britain's ruling Labour Party, so you have to take what he says with complete accuracy. Barry, have we uncovered anything new?
Humphrey, thank you, and thank you to the panel. You've now left me minus 5 minutes in which to do this.
We are extending.
But that is a mark of the quality of the contributions, absolutely. Look, I'll start off with what I perhaps have impertinently marked down as I, and I. And that was when Charles was talking about the war. He talked about it being illegal, he talked about it being incompetent, and if I paraphrase him, inconvenient in terms of its economic impact on the world. He talked about the Pakistan talks and the possibility of them reopening later on this week, and made the point that neither side were stepping away from their established positions, and quoted I think it was The Economist, saying that it's hard to end a war when both sides think they're winning it. Look, we know that President Trump has moved just in the past week from saying he's going to destroy the entire civilization to thinking about doing joint toll booth on the Straits of Hormuz with Iran, and now to the blockade. The idea that there is clear strategy. Charles was right in assessing the American intervention as being incompetent in that respect. But he was also right, I think, in saying that perhaps the war was identifying a new weapon of mass destruction, not the nuclear program in Iran, but actually the Straits of Hormuz. Now, Sina Toossi spoke of the different approaches taken by the US to Iran. He talked about the maximum pressure put on by Trump 1 in terms of economic sanctions, but in Trump 2, the hawks had come to the fore, thinking that one last push might collapse the Iranian regime. And he pointed out that Trump has admitted that he didn't think that Iran could or would hit back in the way that it has. But Iran now has much greater leverage and is much more aware of that leverage that it now has. Venezuela is clearly a model that Trump may have thought was able to be used in Iran, but if he thought that a few weeks ago, he certainly will not be thinking it now. Prashant Kumar, I thought, posed a very interesting question when he said if the US doesn't address its own failings, its own analytical failings, then are we doomed or fated to see more such wars breaking out like this? Dr. Maryam Alemzadeh talked about the IRGC's self-image of power. She also spoke about the informality and flexibility that's built into the IRGC, and I think this was a very important point. She was clear that the IRGC sits over all as a state operation. It's more than a shadow state. And with the current war, the Guards are presenting a more united force, but it's ad hoc, it's fighting at will, she said. The decentralized order has helped them in that respect. And she spoke of this mosaic doctrine, which this fragmentation, so that there is no one seat of power. Again, a very different model from what the US may have assumed. She spoke of two hypotheses, that the war condition itself pushes you to the upper limits of your rationality. And she also said the elimination of Khamenei himself, because he kept everything uncertain. There was an element of brinkmanship, saying he would do something, then denying that he would do it, or telling people he would never negotiate when he was. In many ways, that's reminiscent of Trump himself, that sort of doing so many different and disassociated things that it's very difficult to keep track on what the real aim is. But she said now there is greater strategic focus, And it's also possible that post-war, they may have to be more rational and focus on rebuilding the economy. So the IRGC holds the supreme position over the regular army. Iran has multiple repressive forces, and not all protests are crushed just by the IRGC. I thought another interesting point there about that distinction between a generation that has been through a war, lived through war, and as a result has become more moderate. And she said then the second generation had not lived through a war. And it'll be interesting to see whether, in fact, this experience does make them more moderate. Now, of course, that we just heard at the end there, people saying, no, it may be harsher, it may be a purge that is to come. But a thought there about the historic context, about what happens to a generation who has experienced war. Dr. Maral Kabini cautioned that the removal of Ayatollah would lead to a collapse. This was, she said, it may have been a strategic mistake, but it was always hope against hope that would take place. The Islamic Republic, she said, is not reducible to one individual. The system is designed to survive shocks because authority is not concentrated in a way that disappears when one person disappears. That authority is simply, I think she used the phrase, reabsorbed and reorganized. But she pointed out resilience is not the same as stability. It's a system neither willing or able, nor able to meet the basic needs of its citizens. And therein lies a huge instability. The regime has, she said, an ever-shrinking social base, and that base itself is a fragmented one. The Iranian people are not, perhaps as the US might have thought, a monolith that can rise up with one leader against the regime, as Trump was saying, it's now over to you, people of Iran. This is your moment. She pointed out they're fragmented. They have different grievances. It's not that there can be one unifying means of emancipating them. But she did talk about some actors being better placed to emancipate the people. And there, I thought it was interesting that she highlighted women and also labor movements. But she said Iran is not on the verge of collapse. It's not a society moving in one direction. It's a layered system managing that fragmentation. And I think she believes that fragmentation will be increasingly managed through coercion. Thomas Juneau gave us a very different perspective. Islamic Republic economically weakened by strikes, but he thought would be more repressive. And he spoke of the transnational repression, the way in which the regime attacks those who are the expatriate communities, perhaps the dissident communities living abroad. Spoke of the tools of repression, the physical threat, the online threat, the use of threats against one's families if they're at home in Iran, and said that, in fact, that was the biggest issue. And I think we can all understand that you're able to bear so much for yourself. What you find much more difficult is to bear it for your families and those closest to you. It was interesting that he said that their perception, those communities' perception of the state, at least in Canada, was that the state didn't really care. And he pointed out that the extent of fragmentation facilitates Iran's transnational repression. He said, what triggers it? Well, it's the sense of regional vulnerability, regime vulnerability, and the enhanced diaspora mobilization. So when the diaspora become more vocal, the repression is harder, and when the regime is more vulnerable, again, the repression is harder. So there, very, very much a sense that the future is one of purges, one of harshness, one of reprisal. I wanted to just add something, because we haven't really, I think, looked at the international perspective of the fallout after the war. It's clear that Japan, Turkey, China, India, they have already been in negotiations with Iran for their vessels to have safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz. Now, of course, as I said, the US government has moved its position on the Straits rather dramatically 3 times in the past week. But my concern, I think, in the future is not only that the world is going to suffer increased economic adversity as a result of the oil prices, but also about all the goods that come through the Straits. But it's also this. Iran now sees that it has a huge chokehold, not just on the West, but actually on its Gulf neighbors. Now, Keir Starmer was there earlier over the weekend and last week, speaking with the leaders of the Gulf states. And I asked him in Parliament yesterday whether he had received assurances from them that they would not negotiate similar deals with Iran for their own vessels to pass through the Straits. Because, of course, their economies, the petrodollar economies that they rely on, are going to be suffering severely as a result of the ongoing blockade and continuing impact there. So my worry is that it could be that others do deals for themselves, and the Straits are left finally in the hands of Iran in a way that is deeply unsettling for many of us in the rest of the world, who will see their cost of living, their cost of energy, their cost of food soar violently. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that final thought that expands us out globally. I want to go very quickly, because we are over time, back to the panel. Just give us your top line, whatever you think is the most important thing of this whole issue. Sina, Toossi.
Yes, top line, we'll have to see if negotiations start again at the end of this week, whether in Pakistan or now they're reporting maybe Geneva or elsewhere. And if both sides can reach a middle ground solution, especially on issues of Iranian enrichment, a moratorium on enrichment, opening up the Strait of Hormuz, ending these blockades. So that's the most important thing to watch out for in the next couple of days.
Thank you. Maryam Alemzadeh. Are you with us?
I'm sorry, Humphrey, I lost your audio, so I'm trying to lip read that you called my name.
Yes. Just give us your final thought. In a couple of seconds.
Assuming you asked for final remarks,
yeah.
I just want to end on the note that I hope some sort of agreement is reachable between Iran and the United States for the sake of the Iranian people. I have all of my family in Iran, but even if I didn't, the people are the ones suffering most strongly from all this. We usually stick to the geopolitical analysis and the analysis of will they rise up, will they not? But the suffering is very real. The economic conditions are times and times worse than they were before the war. And the day the ceasefire or hopefully a more permanent truce starts will be the start of a very new struggle for the people of Iran.
Thank you for that. Maral, Karimi?
Very briefly, just to reiterate, I don't think the regime is collapsing, but at the same time, it's not stable. The real question I think we need to be focusing on is whether it's not whether or not change is going to happen. I think change is coming to Iran, but the question is how this change is going to be shaped, who's going to be participating in shaping it, and how the international community should be helping out the more progressive, emancipatory voices in Iran.
Thank you very much for that. And Thomas Juneau?
Thomas wrote a note. I think he had a hard stop at 10. I think he had to leave.
Okay. But, well, thank you very much, everybody, for that. Times Wing charity attacks. In fact, we've staged it off for almost 20 minutes. But thank you, Sina, Toossi, Maryam Alemzadeh, Maral, Karimi, and Thomas Juneau. And thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this debate happen. Our next is on April the 28th at 2 p.m. London time. Bangladesh, a new political chapter. After what they call the world's first Gen Z street protests toppled the government 2 years ago. That will be a fascinating Democracy Forum examination. But until then, thank you for being with us. Stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.